Subnautica Below Zero had big shoes to fill. After the massive success of Subnautica, Unknown Worlds had gamers excited for what they could deliver with more production resources. Enter Below Zero, the franchise's first spin-off sent years after the event of the original game. This time, players explore the polar ice caps of planet 4546b as Robin Au, a xenologist on a personal mission to uncover the truth behind her sister's mysterious disappearance. Early on, Robin finds herself stuck with Al-An, a precursor being from the alien race that once dominated 4546b. This marked the first time Unknown Worlds gave players a direct glimpse of the precursors. This had fans buzzing with anticipation. Would Below Zero finally uncover the deeper history of this enigmatic world? Well, yes and no. We'll get into that. Sadly, the game fell short of these expectations. Development hurdles, including voice actor changes and the departure of the lead story writer and a full narrative rework, hampered its potential. What was meant to be a thrilling spin-off ended up being a disjointed and underwhelming game. Adding fuel to the fire, some of the gaming community dismissed the game as ultra woke, accusing it of prioritizing representation over gameplay, despite these aspects having very little relevance to the story. Subnautica Below Zero as a game itself fell short in many ways when compared to the original. The progression didn't flow anywhere near as well. The lack of darkness and loneliness completely missed the mark that the original hit so well. With Subnautica 2 just around the corner, let's take a deep dive into Below Zero to see what went wrong and how it can be avoided so that Subnautica 2 is the slam dunk game we all expected Below Zero to be. Subnautica and Below Zero, while are fundamentally similar games, Below Zero falls far short of being anything amazing. It's like Subnautica is that 6'5" football player, and Below Zero is me, the 5'9" water boy who makes YouTube videos. Below Zero strays from some of the things that made the original so lovable. The themes of isolation aren't there because there's so much contact with Al-An, the world doesn't feel as large, and the map isn't, and that feeling of terror when you're deep down in a dark place, unsure if you're alone, simply isn't there. Now don't get me wrong, Below Zero isn't a horrible game, and if you didn't play the original Subnautica, you'd probably enjoy Below Zero because you haven't been spoiled like a trust fund kid by the original game. Below Zero doesn't really feature any biomes that are dark and eerie like the original. A good chunk of the game takes place in fairly shallow water or on land, and the land aspects are obnoxiously tedious. And when you do go into the deep down, the glow from flora and fauna make having a torch almost redundant. Below Zero could have used the idea of having a much smaller map to its advantage. Instead of pushing the feeling of large unknown areas with predators lurking unseen, like the original did, they could have pushed themes of claustrophobia. But again, even the caves in Below Zero are quite small and strangely full of light. The biome transitions in Below Zero are so sudden, they feel like the biomes were made in separate parts and then just chucked together when they went to build the map. They don't really make sense. While in Subnautica, you barely notice your changing biome until you are eaten by something that you could have sworn was not there. While making the map significantly smaller, Unknown Worlds also slowed all of the vehicles and the player, making the game just feel sluggish. Even swimming 100 meters feels like a chore. Speaking of vehicles, Unknown Worlds did bring back the prawn suit and the sea glide from the original game, and then nerfed it to the ground. They're incredibly slow, and the prawn suit is no longer Tarzan with its grappling hook. And they didn't bring the sea moth to Below Zero, which was an interesting choice. Instead, they created the sea truck, which is a slower moving sea moth with a painfully slow entrance animation. The sea truck is a hybrid of the Cyclops and the sea moth. It can be attached with extra modules to create a mobile base, but for exploration, it's slow, clunky, and pretty annoying to use. The Cyclops provided a challenge. You had to adapt to piloting a vehicle made for 3 people. You couldn't drive and repair at the same time, so when you needed repairs, you had to get out of the Cyclops and repair the outside. The sea truck you can repair from the inside simply by standing up, which just completely removes a massive part of that challenge Subnautica brought to the table. Speaking of challenges, I have no money. My Patreon is in the description. Oh, right, Subnautica's challenges. The main challenge of Subnautica was survival. The resources were scarce, and there were very few man-made structures dotted throughout the world that provided resources like food. Below Zero is a completely different experience. The smaller area has man-made bases and supply drops almost every 100 meters. These bases provide a large amount of water, food, and other resources, and now I understand it's been years since the original, but they didn't have to make them so resource heavy. They're abandoned, just like in the previous game. Veteran players of the original game found almost no challenge in Below Zero because their inventory was stocked like a supermarket shelf. The addition of more specific outcrops for each resource were nice, but it removed some of the randomness since every outcrop had a chance to drop titanium and its outcrop specific resource. You usually would end up with a metric ton of titanium and nowhere to put it. That survival challenge and feeling of being alone that made Subnautica so successful was lacking in Below Zero, so it was just relegated to just another survival game, where resources were for some reason plentiful. But worst of all, the story. The story of Subnautica was one of its most praised parts of the game. The idea that the player would have to discover their own way through a completely non-linear story respected that player's independence and made you feel like you were in a living, breathing world, rather than just following a pre-planned narrative Joe from the writing department put together. Below Zero is painful. The characters simply aren't interesting enough to warrant being voiced. The actual voice lines depict Robin as an immature kid who sat at the back of the classroom, and Alan, despite being a centuries-old alien from an insanely powerful race, more or less comes across as a chihuahua in a rich lady's purse. And don't get me started on Marguerite, who managed to completely avoid the Kara. Remember? That virus? The entire story of the original game? The game's story simply doesn't respect the player. Alan tells you where to go, what to find, and how to solve the problem. There's just no puzzles. I would have loved to discover the ending for myself, but I knew exactly what the ending was because Alan told me less than halfway through the game what the objective was. Below Zero completely missed the mark when it came to its story, and that could be because of the challenges they had during its development. Below Zero had the development from hell, almost as bad as Skull and Bones. That video will be in a few months. The original plan for Below Zero was to be a DLC for Subnautica, and if it stayed as a DLC, it would have been one hell of a DLC. But it moved to a standalone game due to the scope of the project expanding. Now, if you're about to comment, it's a standalone expansion. No, it's not. It was priced the same as the original game. Unknown Worlds said that Below Zero wasn't a sequel to Subnautica, but instead it was a spin-off game. However, the project lead, David Kalina, said in an interview that same day that it was a sequel. So from the get-go, the team didn't really have an idea of what they were releasing. To make things worse, in 2019, the narrative writer for Below Zero left for other projects. The Unknown Worlds team brought on a new writer and completely rewrote the original story, which players really liked the original story. It was significantly better. Players actively roll back their updates so they can play that unfinished story again. This led to a number of problems. Firstly, because of the entirely new story, objectives, and cutscenes, it broke all saves, made them unplayable. Which, while the game was in early access, it is highly unusual that saves don't carry over between updates, especially for a survival game like this. This set the game story back to square one, giving players not much else to do than to start building up their bases again. Eventually, the new story was finished and most players agreed the original was significantly better, which is unfortunate. Another side effect that came from this story being completely rewritten was the change in voice actors. The original voice actors were far better than the new ones, however, during scheduling conflicts, they were unable to re-record the lines, forcing Below Zero to come back with a new and albeit lackluster cast. While developing Subnautica, Unknown Worlds were praised for listening to their community, making sure the game not only met their vision, but also the community's idea of a game they wanted to play. Below Zero did none of this. Early access felt like gamers were just getting access to the updates early, rather than providing feedback for its development. No matter how much players pleaded that the giant shrimp that was supposed to be the apex predator was placed so poorly, it was never moved. Leviathans in Subnautica were placed strategically. You didn't want to run into them, but they guarded landmarks that were extremely useful to the endgame, or locations that held vast resources. In Below Zero, he guards an entrance to a cave that you have to go down so often, you don't fear the shrimp. You name him Greg like an Australian names their pet spider. He also pales in comparison to the Reaper Leviathan, both in design and in size. I'll give them a pass on the location of the Shadow Leviathan because you don't want to go down to the Crystal Cave super often, and it guards basically the final story beat, but I'd love to see him bigger. Imagine this thing being the size of a Ghost Leviathan. The development of Below Zero struggled as devs wanted to try something new, which I give them credit for, but as the scope of Below Zero expanded from being a small DLC to something much larger, they needed to borrow elements from the original game that made it work so well, rather than just completely changing the ethos of what had worked well in the past. Hopefully Subnautica 2 doesn't go down the same development woes that plagued Below Zero. I mean, hey, they got that Game Pass money now. Now, quite possibly the most ridiculous part of this essay, Below Zero copped it from the bottom of the barrel gamers claiming it was ultra woke. While other gamers were sure this was a copy pasta, these people claiming that the game was ultra woke were absolutely serious. Now, while there are sometimes genuine arguments for this, Below Zero featured no woke elements that actually affected the gameplay. So I decided to dig and find out what these Reddit users were actually complaining about, and I still don't understand why. The most common complaint was the characters. Robin being a black female and her sister Sam being a black lesbian female, none of which has anything to do with the story or gameplay of the game. You can replace Sam and Robin with Craig and Darren, or even with Shazza and Bazza. The story would still be an older sibling going to save their younger sibling because of a big bad corporation. Their race, sexual preference, and gender has absolutely no effect on the game. And to be honest, I didn't actually know Sam was a lesbian until researching for this video. They just wanted an excuse to complain about why the story sucked without actually analyzing the story and realizing it was just poorly written. Subnautica has always had underlying themes of corporate greed. The Altera Corporation is there to make money, and you see that in their actions of negligence, which is clearly present in Subnautica. These narrative elements complemented the original game, because you were stranded on 4546B, being tasked with getting your own way home, and at the end of the game, it even jokes that you have to pay a ton of money for all the resources that you extracted and used from 4546B. But in Below Zero, Altera seems to have been spending a ton of money on all these bases and equipment on Sector Zero, which doesn't make a ton of sense. Wouldn't a company driven so clearly by corporate greed want the Xeno workers they send down to the planet to set up their own equipment? Similar to Satisfactory. Rather than dropping supply locations so frequently in the water, the Altera from Subnautica doesn't quite match the Altera in Below Zero, which makes it feel like the social issues were completely stripped from the game, bringing the focus to the representation, causing all of these ultra woke allegations. If those themes of corporate greed were still present, the characters' backstories wouldn't have been in the forefront, because they're quite literally the only semi-interesting part about the game's narrative. Subnautica 2 has the chance to become just like its predecessor, a fantastic game loved by all types of gamers, with a terrifying environment bringing out the fear of the unknown, without actually being a horror game. But it could also end up like Below Zero if they decide to try something new again. Unknown Worlds needs to build upon the original game's themes, mechanics, and elements that were loved by so many, not completely rework them. The addition of co-op is something that so many players have wanted for Below Zero, but it didn't happen. So hopefully the co-op implementation in Subnautica 2 is stable. This is a perfect example of adding things that players wanted without completely reworking the core vision of the game, because Subnautica 2 will be on a whole new planet, Unknown Worlds will have to start world building from scratch. The world needs to be alive, the biomes need to blend together and make sense while creating this feeling of scale and being alone. I also hope that Unknown Worlds goes back to an unvoiced protagonist, allowing the PDA and world to tell the story without massive conversations explaining what to do, where to go, and how to solve a puzzle. Their story needs to respect the player's independence, allowing them to discover the full story and the world at their own pace, all while roping them in to a world that is full of life. We know Subnautica 2 will launch in early access, so gamers will get to see the story being written, and hopefully we don't get a rewrite. The early access period needs to allow the game to be refined through player feedback without losing that magic that made Subnautica such a breakout game. Now, Below Zero wasn't a terrible game. It was lackluster and it paled in comparison to its predecessor in gameplay elements, overall flow, and a story that was actually interesting. But I played the original so heavily, and it was actually the reason I bought myself a gaming PC, so I didn't have to play it on my Mac. Below Zero's shortcomings because of this felt all the more massive, all because Unknown Worlds did such a phenomenal job on the original. If you would like to check out my in-depth video on Subnautica, click the link in the cards now. A massive shout out to all the patrons that support the channel. Patrons do receive early access to videos and the bloopers, and that's in the description below.